Professor Franklin, I'm going to ask you to consider now your knowledge of the risks of hepatitis and, in due course, AIDS. But before we look at any specific documents, what, if anything, can you recall being taught in your general medical training and then your haematology training about the risks of viral transmission from blood and blood products?
Well, when I was in Leeds, my main mentor, a chap called Brian Roberts, Dr. Roberts, did say that, you know, blood transfusion was one of the more dangerous treatments in a way, which sounds a bit dramatic, and I think he was largely thinking of cross-match mistakes, blood group errors, but I think it did extend into concerns about hepatitis. He did, however, sort of temper that by saying it seemed to be mainly a problem in the USA rather than in the UK. I mean, I think, relatively speaking, that may be true, but I think we now know that there was a lot of hepatitis risk in the UK. So that was there. As I say, when I was at the blood transfusion centre, most of the experience or the training was in hepatitis B, and I think there was a sense of denial about NonA, NonB in the UK. There was a meeting in the Medical Research Council meeting about NonA, NonB hepatitis in 1979, when the then director of the regional transfusion centre where I was training in Edgware, Tom Cleghorn, said that he thought there was very little post-transfusion hepatitis in the UK at the time, and quoted the fact that they were transplanting 1.75 million units of red cells at that time. It's a huge amount. His colleague, Dr. Maycott from BPL, agreed with that there wasn't much post-transfusion hepatitis. And even Dame Sheila Sherlock agreed, although she did caution about the use of commercial concentrates in that. So I think there was a sort of sense that the UK was protected by its non-remunerated volunteer donor population from this. So I didn't have a lot of awareness or understanding about it, other than that, you know, what one got from textbooks or things like that.
In just before we look at some of the materials that you've referred to in your statement, what kind of journals, medical journals or other sources of information did you routinely have access to and would read?
Well, it varied a little over time. I mean, throughout my career, that would be the British Medical Journal and the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. During my research, it would have been papers about sickle cell disease, the journal Blood, which is probably the most prestigious haematology journal, various other journals over time, online papers now, really. In the last 15 years, you're more likely to look for specific papers rather than open a magazine.
In your evidence to the Archer inquiry, which we'll look at, ARCH 608, and if we go to page 27, I think it should be. Next page, please. Yes, so you say this about non-A, non-B hepatitis, picking it up 4 lines down. Certainly to my mind, it was not taken that seriously until a publication from the Sheffield group was published in 1985 with the lead author of Dr. Hay, who showed quite clearly that quite a lot of patients with these liver abnormalities actually had significant liver damage. And then you refer to a 1983 publication from Manchester. So your recollection at the time you were giving your evidence to Archer was that it was this publication in 1985 which was significant in your own understanding of NonA, NonB, is that right?
Well, yes. I think, though, I don't know, you'll be talking to both of the key workers on this paper, Charles Hay and Eric Preston, and I'm be interested to hear what they say. I think when you look back now, I would say that there's a high risk that a lot of this was damage due to a combination of hepatitis C and HIV. I think Professor Lee's evidence last week suggested that hepatitis C on its own, while certainly not being benign, was certainly consistent with long-term survival in most cases.
In your witness statement, if we go please to WITN 4032001, and we go to page 26. Picking it up in the last two paragraphs, you talk about NonA, NonB hepatitis being considered to be mild and relatively benign, and say that this unfortunately this reflected a lack of knowledge of the full long-term history of NonA, NonB. And then you refer again to the to the Manchester paper, and then the Sheffield paper.
Yeah.
We'll just look at those briefly, and then the textbook you refer to, as I think those are the particular documents you suggest that you were influenced by. But before we do that, you say you would have learned more about NonA, NonB hepatitis from the reports by Dr. Krask at the UKHCDO. Would you have seen those before becoming a director?
No.
So only from 1983 onwards. Yeah. And then we'll just look at the other documents that you refer to. So the Manchester paper is WITN 4032009. I hope, Henry. No.
Yeah, that's the Manchester paper.
Certainly not the report I've got. Do you have PRSC 302564, Henry? Okay, so this is a full copy of the Manchester paper. So this, I think, is the paper you're referring to, Liver Disease and Haemophiliacs, an Overstated Problem, 1983. And we can see it refers to biopsy on 12 multi-transfused haemophiliacs from the Manchester area with persistently abnormal liver function tests. If we go, please, to, Henry, to the last, sorry, it's page number 654 of the report, Henry. I think it's probably the 6th page, the electronic document. That's it. We go to the last paragraph on that page. We can see it says, in this study, only one patient was found to have CAH, that's chronic active hepatitis, with progression to micronodular cirrhosis. 4 other patients had only mild chronic active hepatitis. We suggest that the true incidence of severe histological liver abnormality in multi-transfused haemophiliacs may be less than previously reported, but similar to the more recent results of 115 liver biopsies carried out worldwide, Alidort, 1981, where the incidence of chronic active hepatitis and cirrhosis was 16%. And then it goes on to say that liver biopsies may not be indicated, perhaps for self-evident reasons. Was this a study which you recall reading at the time?
Yes.
Do you recall any discussions with Professor Hill about NonA, NonB hepatitis or the risks of liver disease?
Well, yeah, I think we did. I mean, can I remember a particular moment? I mean, no, I can't. I think my knowledge of NonA, NonB hepatitis was quite limited until I started looking after the men with haemophilia. And that's interesting because I was doing bone marrow transplants. The patients with sickle cell disease, some of those were multi-transfused, and yet it didn't seem to be something that was appearing in them. And for that reason, it wasn't something that was foremost in my concern until I began to look after the haemophilia patients, and it was obvious that all of them had, or virtually all of them, had abnormal liver function tests. So when this paper came along about the time I began, either just about the time I started, or maybe it was a bit before, but it was certainly around that time, it seemed to be, it's not actually that reassuring when you read it again.
That's what I was going to ask you about, Professor Franklin. It's a study of 12 patients, I think.
So the only thing I would say is a very small study looking back.
Yes, as indeed many of them are. And then if we look at the reference to Alador, which was a slightly bigger study, 16% CAH and cirrhosis, it's not a small figure. It's still a significant figure.
Yeah.
Do you recall whether either you or Dr. Hill at the time had any opportunity to discuss this issue with liver specialists in Birmingham?
Well, we did have liver specialists there. I don't remember discussing that, sorry. I do remember Frank Hill and myself talking about whether we should be doing liver biopsies, and we decided against. I think, to be quite honest, I think by the time the Hay and Preston study came out, the issue was largely resolved, and I think we felt what was the point? It's risky. You're well aware that there was a death at the Royal Free Hospital. Yes. Not that money was the issue, but you need a lot of factor VIII to safely do this. So we decided we wouldn't do that. 1983, the liver unit was only just starting at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. There was a liver expert there, a guy called Elias, very good. He used to come and see my other haematology patients. There's no reason why we wouldn't have discussed these with him, but no, I don't think we had any systematic approach with the liver unit, no.
And then the 1985 Hay and Preston paper, Henry, I'm hoping I've got the right reference here, PRSE 304229. PRSE 0004229. Do you have that? Thank you. So this is the 1985 study that you referred to in the Lancet. And we can see there, and it refers to there being an 8-year study of 79 unselected patients with haemophilia and evidence of chronic progressive liver disease in at least 21%. 8 patients had chronic active hepatitis and 9 had cirrhosis. What, if anything, can you recall your reaction to this paper being?
Well, concern. It's quite, serious data. I mean, I think as a pure study in hepatitis, then I think the difficulty is that these were probably taken from many patients who also had HIV. So that affects its value as a pure study on NonA, NonB hepatitis. But in terms of the seriousness to people with haemophilia, it's obviously pretty bad news. The only problem is, and certainly was there wasn't really any treatment. So in terms of what we discussed, it was, and what we discussed with the individual people, was that this may not be good, and we probably reinforced avoiding alcohol, not a lot else you can do. It also, of course, was published at the height of the worry about HIV. So I think a lot of the discussions in my clinic were dominated by worries about HIV and AIDS.
You've also referred in your statement to the publication by Sheila Sherlock. And again, I think in fairness to your evidence, we should probably look at that, because you say you did recall consulting this textbook.
Yeah, I mean, I did. That was my source of knowledge about liver disease, really.
And you've referred in your statement to two passages. Oh, sorry, you've referred in your statement to one passage, and then more
since
recently
realised
another.
there are two passages relevant to NonA, NonB in this book. Yeah.
So we'll look at the passage you referred to expressly in your statement first of all. Henry, it's WITN 4032021, please. So we can, this is page 290 of the book. We can pick it up at the bottom of the page. Chronic NonA, NonB hepatitis. Serial studies have shown that patients with acute NonA, NonB hepatitis progress to chronic liver disease. This applies to the blood transfusion-related, the blood factor-related, and the sporadic disease. The incidence of chronicity seems to be about 30 to 40%. So that would suggest a significant number of patients, a very significant number of patients proceeding to a chronic liver disease.
Well, it's probably actually an underestimate.
And then if we just look at the next page, which was the second, I'm sorry, Henry, it's a different reference. WITN 4032022. And then we can see the clinical features set out. Chronic hepatitis can follow both the long and short incubation types. It says chronicity may develop insidiously. The acute episode would not have been recognised if the patient had not been under medical observation. A characteristic feature is the marked fluctuation in serum transaminase levels extending over many months. And then liver histology shows the general features of chronic hepatitis, usually of persistent or mild chronic active type. And then we see the next column, prognosis and course. It says clinical progress is towards improvement, but cirrhosis has been reported. And then treatment, reassurance and regular supervision at approximately 3 to 6 month intervals. So this is 1981, this publication. So that was the part that you referred to in your statement. And then you've produced,
well,
I think...
Just one moment before you go further. Can you help me to understand the expression clinical progress is towards improvement? Because this is looking at a chronic disease which is measurable only by transaminase values, but otherwise one assumes is progressive in its natural way. We know now, as a matter of fact, or at least a matter of expert report to the inquiry, it is progressive.
Yeah.
So clinical progress, does that mean that the transaminase values tend to not be as bad later on, or what does it mean?
Well, I can only speculate that it reflects uncertainties at the time, because there are parts of this that seem to be suggesting one thing and parts that seem to be suggesting something else.
Yes.
So on the one hand, people go on to get cirrhosis. On the other hand, most people improve. And also, we are supposed to be reassuring people. That word crops up on quite a number of occasions.
So, but reassuring may mean telling people what isn't the case. But
well,
it raises your view.
I would hope not, but it could. Yes.
That's why I
that
used
would
the
be
word
inappropriate
may.
reassurance, wouldn't it? Yeah. I think I think it reflects the fact that even Dame Sheila Sherlock didn't really know what was going to be happening.
Do you happen to know she actually wrote this chapter?
I think this volume she wrote herself solely, this whole book. I think later volumes she had co-authors. Or maybe you
Just checking.
Council has the
I have the
volume, but I
original
think
book.
it's a single volume text, single author text, sorry. Only her name on the...
It's certainly only
plate.
her name. I can look in more detail, sir, at the preface and acknowledgements, but there isn't another author whose name is given on the text. And you've also drawn the inquiry's attention to an earlier passage in the book, pages 257 to 259. Henry, those are at WITN 4032023. Good. Is there another page? Keep going.
I'm fairly sure it's only her that wrote the whole book from that plate.
And yes, certainly the plate only contains her name. You're right, Professor. So we see here, this is the other passage that you've drawn attention to, pages 257 onwards, non-A, non-B hepatitis. The elimination of hepatitis A and hepatitis B from transfused blood did not eliminate post-transfusion hepatitis. Some of the cases were due to cytomegalo infection, but the majority were due to another virus or viruses termed non-A, non-B. This infection now accounts for about 75% of post-transfusion hepatitis. Goes on to say haemophiliacs receiving factor concentrates obtained from commercial sources are particularly at risk. Non-A, non-B hepatitis is largely blood spread. And then if we go over the page, we can see it says the agent's not been conclusively identified. It's been transmitted to chimpanzees. And then the clinical course is then described, an incubation period. The acute episode is usually mild and often anicteric. Fulminant hepatitis is rare. And then the end of that paragraph says cirrhosis can develop. And then it talks about in liver biopsies. We go to the next page. There's a description there of what might be seen in liver biopsies. And then it says non-A, non-B hepatitis often progresses to a mild chronic hepatitis. The prognosis of this is at the moment uncertain, but probably benign. Unfortunately, there's no reference that's one way or another in relation to that last section.
No. I mean, I think I wrote somewhere else in my statement that when it became clear that a lot of the men that I was looking after had got HIV, that I looked back at their notes from the period when I wasn't there, and I was quite shocked to discover that virtually on the first injection of concentrate, regardless of type, they developed abnormal liver function tests. And I like to think that had I been there at that time, I might have been more concerned to not carry on. But I'm ashamed to say I'm not sure I would have had that strength of character to go against the prevailing view. But I think this is sort of showing that, to be honest, I would interpret this as uncertainty from someone who was the world expert, not really knowing what's going to happen, to be honest. And I think also when we look back, she hadn't got a long enough longitudinal experience of a disease that can take 15, 20, 30 years to destroy someone's liver.
So in terms of the materials that you recall seeing at the time, bearing in mind that you were assuming responsibility for people with bleeding disorders in 1982, 1983, other documents that we've looked at, you recall looking at this book, you recall the Manchester report, you recall the Hay-Preston 1985 study. The inquiry sent you some earlier and other materials from the second half of the 1970s through to 1980.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very happy to go through them with you if it would assist Professor Franklin, but they include publications from in the Lancet from Prince, and then in 1978 an earlier study from Professor Preston, which, if I can put it this way, is not inconsistent with the 1985 study. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's quite small, but yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And we've sent you also some material from Dr. Krask from 1978, reporting some American information about liver biopsies with 50% showing changes compatible with cirrhosis. I think we've sent you a letter which we've looked at with a number of witnesses from Dr. Kernoff to Dr. Colvin, describing non-A, non-B hepatitis in 1979 as a serious disease with long-term consequences. You wouldn't, I imagine, have seen that letter at the time. Do you recall whether in the second half of the 70s you came across any of the materials that we've provided you with?
Well, if I did, they didn't impact that well. You showed a number of papers from Harvey Alter and colleagues. I don't remember those. It's quite likely I read the Prince paper, but it didn't impact on me. I'm ashamed to say no. Don't remember it.
As I say, I'm happy to go to each of those materials if it would assist Professor Franklin. But in an attempt to shortcut it, would you agree that looking at that material, which you may not have seen at the time, that paints a rather different picture of non-A, non-B? It doesn't suggest it's necessarily going to be a mild or benign infection. It suggests it may be something rather more serious.
It does. I'd still stick to my statement that I felt that there was a bit of an atmosphere of denial in the UK over the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis from UK blood transfusion. And that was the area in which I had experience at that time. I didn't have experience of treatment with concentrates, particularly not concentrates from America, until through towards the end of 82. I started in 82, towards the middle and end of 83 probably.
I think one of our witnesses used the term that there may have been a degree of wishful thinking on the part of haemophilia clinicians, not wanting to think of non-A, non-B hepatitis as something serious because of what was seen as the very great benefits that factor concentrates have brought. Do you feel able to comment upon that from your own experience and perspective?
I think there was definitely wishful thinking about HIV Aids in some of the papers I've seen. I think there was in 1995, if you allow me to sort of mention it, there was an Institute of Medicine book from the United States that looked back at the disaster in relation to hepatitis and HIV, and it came up with a hypothesis that there wasn't enough effort made to introduce heat-treated safe products because there was a feeling that hepatitis was if you let me look at, I've scribbled this down. Hepatitis was viewed as an acceptable risk. This is not me saying this. By governmental regulatory advisory agencies responsible for the safety of blood and blood products, by the plasma fractionation industry, and by the physicians looking after haemophiliacs. It also says, and I don't agree with this, by individuals with haemophilia. But I do think that hepatitis at that time does appear to have been viewed as an acceptable risk. I mean, it was surely it must have gone to the Committee on Safety of Medicines, all these people getting hepatitis. I don't know.
Can I just see whether we're looking at the same document? Is that the HIV in the blood supply and analysis of crisis decision making?
Yes, yeah.
So we've got that, I hope, at WITN 4032024. Is that the right document, Professor Franklin?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, it is.
And
Yeah.
what was the page you were referring to?
That's a good question. If Henry could run down, it's not far from the front. There should be 4 bullet points, I think. 2 hypotheses. A bit further, please. Next page.
Oh, yes. I think it's your second point. Then hepatitis
Here we
was
are.
viewed
Yes.
as an acceptable risk by the government regulatory agencies responsible for the safety of blood and blood products, the plasma fractionation industry, the physicians who treated the individuals with haemophilia. Pausing there, that I think is the bit that you're associating yourself with.
Well, I think
It's a
it looks as
description.
if that was the case, yes. And in terms of wishful thinking, I suppose the hope was it wasn't very serious.
And in terms of the 1985 Hay-Preston research, would you accept that that wasn't something which showed something radically new or different? It was rather perhaps confirmatory of earlier fears. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Yeah. Well, I think it was the final sort of straw that, as it turned out, maybe it wasn't all hepatitis C, but what it definitely meant was that we were going to see a lot of bad liver disease in that group of men who were having those concentrates before effective heat treatment. Yeah.
We'll move on to HIV AIDS. I think I understand from your statement, you think you would have seen the MMWR report in 1982.
I started looking at them. They weren't easy to find, but yeah, I did, because that was where I think I mentioned in my report that the pre-internet era, actually knowledge was quite powerful when I think about it, because not everybody had it. Now everybody has knowledge. So so we all knew that AIDS was happening in the gay men in America. The journals were months out of date, so you really relied on things like MMWR because it was a weekly report, and also word of mouth by experts. Reading journals you had to read the journals, but it was insufficient.
So the July 1982 report we know is the report about PCP being observed in some haemophiliacs in the States. You also, I think, read the New England Journal of Medicine January 1983 Deforge article, and you noted there the recommendation to switch back to cryoprecipitate.
Yes, I wasn't responsible. I was looking after people with haemophilia. It was on my rota, but I wasn't responsible for it at that time. That was quite a prescient article.
And then, if we have up on screen, please, PRSE 302647. This is the note of a meeting on the 24th of January 1983. It was with Immuno to look at hepatitis reduced factor 8. We know, if we go to the last page, please, Henry, we know from the list of attendees that Professor Hill attended, Professor Stewart did not, and this is before you took over as director at Queen Elizabeth. But there's a what appears to be from the minutes quite a lengthy discussion about AIDS. There's a report about the San Francisco baby case that had been reported in the MMWR.
That must have been very shortly before this.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
It wasn't yet published, but that which goes to show the importance of Bush telegraph type communication.
I think it had actually been published in the MMWR for the
for
December.
Beg your pardon, yes.
But it hadn't yet got to the Lancet, which came later.
Yes.
And there's a discussion about the New England Journal of Medicine report. Now, do you know whether this meeting, these updates, was something that did Dr. Hill come back and discuss them with Professor Stewart, to your knowledge, or with you?
I don't remember. This is Frank Bolton's note, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I don't even remember being anyone talking about this meeting. No.
What about the issues that were raised? So the the case of the San Francisco baby, which, as the chair points out, was reported in December of 1982 in the MMWRs, and the issues flagged up by Jane DeForge in her article. Do you recall any conversation about those issues, if not about the meeting?
I remember conversations about the doctors in Birmingham, my colleagues, being very concerned that AIDS was going to be a problem in patients in the UK, not necessarily only men with haemophilia, but we transfuse a lot of blood into people with leukemia. We were worried about them as well. There was a big, well, it was huge issue.
Was it, or when was it reasonably clear to you that AIDS was probably being transmitted by blood and blood products? Was it from these January 1983 reports?
Difficult. Well, I suppose it was actually from, Chairman put me right on the MMWR. I don't know whether I read that one. I read some of them. But certainly by the time that the case of the baby came out, then that was pretty clear. There were still other theories around, but I think they began to fall away.
Now, in your statement, you say, I've got the reference now, you say that when HIV AIDS became a clinical issue, as co-directors we discussed our approach and reached agreement. I'll try and find the reference to that in your statement, but what I wanted to ask you was, what did you mean by that? Co-directors is you and Dr. Hill, so this is presumably after you've taken over in September of 1983 as director. What was the approach and the agreement that was reached?
Sorry, that was from Archer or my current?
That was from your current statement,
right.
And forgive me, I'll find the reference.
Is that in relation to whether the men should be looked after in the infectious diseases unit, or?
I don't think so.
Right.
Let me find it, Professor Franklin, rather than asking you in the abstract. It's one of the few
That would have been later, wouldn't it?
That I haven't noted down. I may have to come back to that tomorrow morning, Professor Franklin, when I found the reference to the specific agreement or discussions that you had with Dr. Hill. Can I ask you about the other materials which your statement suggests or your Archer evidence suggests was influential on your approach and on your thinking? You've referred in your statement to being guided by the advice of others, in particular UKHCDO and the Haemophilia Society, in terms of how to respond to the AIDS crisis.
Well, I now know that wasn't the Hemophilia Society, but yes, I mean, absolutely. It was late 83, wasn't it, the meeting we went to when Morag Chisholm raised the issue of cryo,
Yep, so 17th of October 1983 was that meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was when I came away and thought, well, that's. I can't remember the discussion, but I think that was. We came away with a view to carry on, and then there was the next May, wasn't it? The letter from Professor Bloom to. On the Haemophilia Society note paper saying carry on. So I think that all the advice that I was getting from people who I would have looked up to and expected to give me definitive advice, that was where it came from.
Well, if we'll take it in chronological stages, there's not too much that we need to look at, but the May 83 Haemophilia Society publication, that was actually in 83.
Oh, was it? Okay.
That's WITN 4032 008.
I think I was aware of that at the time, even though I wasn't the co-director, because I think we had weekly meetings of everybody, or maybe not. Maybe Frank wasn't at every one of those because he was mainly at the Children's Hospital, but I do remember this.
And this, as we know, was authored by, or as it says, was authored by Professor Bloom. If we just go a little further down, please, Henry. If we pick it up about halfway down, it says, bearing this in mind, that's the investment in BPL, it is important to consider the facts concerning AIDS and haemophilia. The cause of AIDS is quite unknown, and it has not been proven to result from transmission of a specific infective agent in blood products. And then it goes on to talk about the number of cases being small. We're unaware of any proven case in our own haemophiliac population. And then towards the bottom of that paragraph, whilst it would be wrong to be complacent, it would equally be counterproductive to alter our treatment programmes radically. We should avoid precipitate action and give those experts who are responsible a chance continually to assess the situation. Was this, to some extent at least, influential on your thinking?
Well, it sounds like wishful thinking now, doesn't it? But I think it was, yes. I mean, the advice of the experts, I wasn't an expert. I wasn't an expert at bone marrow transplants, and I would have taken advice from world experts in that as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think that seemed to be the advice. Well, it was the advice. Clear, wasn't it?
There's reference there to being unaware of any proven case in our own haemophiliac population. We know from other materials that there was, in fact, a case.
Well, that seems an economy of the truth, I would have said.
Do you recall when you first became aware of the Cardiff case?
Well, I think it was around about the same time as this. I think it was quite well known. And wasn't there a Bristol one?
Yes.
Was that before or after? I have to say I'm not sure.
The Bristol case was certainly the first death.
Okay.
In the summer of 1983.
Just on the same vein, I heard this morning from what Council was saying that in June, Frank Hill was told that one of the patients of his who was at Trelaws had been reported to show the stigmata of AIDS.
Yeah.
Is that the sort of thing which you would have expected generally to have been mentioned in UKHCDO discussions?
Well, I would have expected it to have been mentioned within the department, but yes. And I mean, I did. I think I may have put in my statement that I didn't recall any of the men in my clinic having stigmata of AIDS before we began testing. So if that had been the case with someone from the children's side, I would have expected to know that.
Yes. Thank you.
I mean, I think this is absolutely vital information
Yes.
to have.
And then if we go from May 1983, this publication, to the UKHCDO meeting that you've referred to, Henry, it's PRSE 004440, please. Check that. Sorry, PRSE 0004440. I think I omitted a zero. We can see your name appearing. This is the 17th of October 1983.
Yeah.
This would presumably have been your first meeting
Yeah.
that you attended as director. And if we go, please, to page 10. This is the discussion that you've referred to already, Professor Franklin. So Dr. Mark Chisholm raising the question of reverting to cryoprecipitate. Professor Bloom's response: no need for patients to stop using the commercial concentrates because at present there was no proof that the commercial concentrates were the cause of AIDS. Might be said that's a somewhat surprising statement. Do you recall whether there was any challenge to that by anybody?
To be frank, I don't even know if I was in the room at the time. No, I don't have any recollection of this. I mean, I've looked at it many times since I think you first showed it to Mark Winter. I remember going to the meeting, and I think I said in my statement that I remember going because it was the first time I've been to a meeting where people with the condition that the meeting was about, i.e. people with haemophilia, were actually present. And I think that was a good thing, but also it was a novel thing, and I remember that. But no, I don't remember this.
The observation you make about it in your witness statement, if we just go back to that, it's WITN 40320001, and it's page 72 of your statement. It's a subparagraph D in the first half of the page. You say, they recommended at the end of the 1983 meeting, that's the meeting we've just been looking at, that patients did not switch from concentrates to cryo. And then you say this, I suspect that was taken not by vote, but by the sapiential authority of the senior figures and a lack of organised alternative opinion. Can I ask you just to elaborate upon what you meant by that?
Well, sapiential authority is the authority that vested in someone by their experience or knowledge, I suppose. And I think from reading the minute, it just seemed to move effortlessly on to the senior figures in the UKHCDO decided that wasn't the right thing. And if Dr. Chisholm disagreed, there's no evidence in the minute that anyone else sided with her. I think that's what I mean.
It may be difficult for you to answer this, Professor Franklin, as I think you only attended this and then the 1984 AGM, but I don't know whether from your discussions with Dr. Hill or any other colleagues you have a view on the organisation of UKHCDO at the time. Was it effectively were policies and recommendations being set by Professor Bloom and the other older, more experienced figures? Was there too much deference? Do you have a view?
Well, I think Mark Winter alluded to the fact that it would have been good to have had some more direct instruction or central advice rather than there's a lot of discussion in all of these notes about individual directors should decide. Well, I was an individual director, but I wasn't very experienced, and actually neither was Mark at that time. But I think we both would have benefited from something a bit more forthright as to what to do. Even whether it was right or wrong, that would have been helpful. I think I've come to be not that happy about the UKHCDO, to be blunt, as someone who was in a very large haemophilia centre that was not a reference centre. And a lot of the minutes and the notes that you and your colleagues have provided came from subgroups of the reference centre directors. And they contain far more useful information than the annual meeting of the UKHCDO, and I don't remember seeing those minutes. I don't think those minutes were circulated to the rank and file, if I can say. And I think that was a shame because they're far more useful than the two meetings I went to. I don't remember why I only went to the first two. It's unlikely that I found them so unhelpful that I didn't want to go, but the fact is I didn't go, and usually if there was something really good and valuable in meetings, I would have attended. The meeting of the AIDS group for the HCDO was, again, reference centres, doctors, very interesting minutes. They would have been very helpful. So I'm sorry we didn't get to see them, or the hepatitis ones, we didn't get to see those. So I do feel a bit sad on behalf of the patients, the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, that we didn't get enough advice. There was more to be had, I think, and I think it would have been. It was never going to be easy, but it would have been better. So definitely, sorry to cut things short. If there'd have been more advice, Mark Winter mentioned the CMO, pretty silent in all this. I don't think it necessarily had to be the CMO, but something definitive as to what we should do.
So I'm note the time. I'm going to move on to look at, again, some of the local West Midlands meetings and the response to the HIV/AIDS crisis. I'm fairly confident we can finish Professor Franklin's evidence in the course of tomorrow morning by lunchtime. So would that be a convenient point to stop for today?
Well, yes, it would. I'm sorry, Professor. I think as you knew, but I'm sorry anyway that you have to come back and spread your evidence over 2 days.
No, that's
just one.
I'm here to help.
Well, thank you very much for that. There's just one thing I want to ask before you finish for the day, and it goes back to a question which Council asked you when she said, in respect of the risk of AIDS from blood products, when were you first clear that the blood products carried AIDS? Can I just alter the question a bit and say, when were you first clear that there was a real risk that they might?
Well, I suppose we were afraid they might, all increasing through 1982.
Thank you.
I don't think I can give you even the baby date, but I think that was always the worry that that was going to happen.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll take a break then till 10 o'clock tomorrow. So 10 o'clock tomorrow.